My name is Leila Zand. I am an Iranian American activist, and I've been with the CODEPINK for a long time. And it is my honor that officially I'm working with them this year.
So I'm Sussan Tahmasebi. I'm an Iranian women's rights activist. I lived and worked in Iran for 11 years, working with the women's movement. Now I'm based in the US, working regionally on promotion of women's rights. And I write and talk about sanctions and also women's rights quite often. And I direct an organization by the name of FEMENA. So it's really my pleasure also to be here today with a stellar group of Iranian scholars, musicians, activists, and I'll turn it over to them to introduce themselves. So let's start with Sussan, the other Sussan.
Would that be me?
Yes, that's you.
Hi, I'm Sussan Deyhim. I'm an Iranian American composer, vocalist, and performance artist. And when I can lend my voice to what needs help, I'm an activist. I've been here since 1980 in the US and left Iran in 1976 for my studies in Europe. I'm very happy to be here and say a couple of words about Iranian women's suffering.
Thank you.
Sima.
Hi, my name is Sima Shakhsari, and I teach at the University of Minnesota in the Department of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies. I came to the US in 1989, have done some activist work with violence against women's groups and queer groups in the US and transnationally. I have a book that is directly addressing sanctions. It's called Politics of Rightful Killing, which basically talks about civil society, gender and sexuality, and the democratization projects of the so-called liberalizing states and their investment in internet freedom at the same time that they impose the deadliest sanctions on the people of Iran. So that is the paradox that I call Politics of Rightful Killing. My current work is with queer and trans refugee applicants in Turkey, and I can talk about how the number of refugees, not just queer and trans refugees, but Afghan refugees who come from Iran have increased in Turkey exactly because of the tightening of sanctions in 2010. And I'm very happy to be here and humbled to be among this wonderful group of scholars, artists, and activists.
Thank you. Fatemeh Jan.
Yeah, hi, I'm Fatemeh Kershavaz, and I'm delighted to be here with this group of amazing women, Iranian American or Iranian other backgrounds. I am a professor of Persian studies at University of Maryland. That's my official engagement. A very important part of my life is to be able to be outside the classroom and reach out to a broader public to speak about Iran in particular at this point, but basically just the cause of peace and justice, whether it's gender justice or class justice, or right now, as we see with the sanctions and with the issues and threats of war on Iran against that kind of imperialist, sorry for using that tainted word, but I can't really think of anything else, to speak up against it and basically try and inform American public about what the country is doing at this very dire time in human history.
Perfect. Thank you very much, everybody.
Salome is also online. Yeah. So
I don't see her. Yeah, sorry, Salome.
No problem. Yeah, I'm Salome MC, and I'm also very honored to be this great company. I'm a musician, multimedia artist, and educator. I left Iran in 2010. I lived in Japan for 7 years and then moved to the US 3 years ago. I've been making music for almost 2 decades now, and I've always written and spoken and sang and rapped about women's rights, human rights, and my anti-war stance, and recently spoken and made songs against the sanctions. In the US now, I work as an educator. I teach music and work specifically with visually impaired kids. But I also, whenever I can, I speak about sanctions and also against the US and Iran militarism.
Beautiful, beautiful. That was the best, I guess. Thank you very much. Thank you everybody for being here. And again, thank you for being and trying to be and being the voice of the voiceless here. And it's amazing to have all of you. And I know that besides the work that we all do, we are in communicating with our families and friends in Iran. I want to just hear from you what you hear from your family and friend in Iran, and give us some information of what do you hear, how do they cope with this, and what are their most difficult part of their daily lives, and how they are trying to survive. And specifically, because this call is about the sanctions, so specifically, please make sure to tell us about their experience that you hear directly with the sanctions. I guess, Salome, can I start with you?
Yeah, definitely. Yes, I'm a musician, so I have a lot of musician friends. But I like to talk about it, especially now because of the current climate with the coronavirus and all of that. I have also a lot of friends and family in the medical field, so I've been talking to them a lot recently, and I like to talk about their experiences right now because it's so urgent. One of the things that happened after the maximum pressure campaign started with the Trump administration, there's big pharmaceutical companies all left Iran. So even if you want to buy medicine from them, you can't, because all the ways of paying that is blocked too. So you can't ship them in. And then you have medical equipment that are falling apart. They can't be fixed. No one is come to fix them. And they can't even send spare parts. And one of the examples I heard from one of my friends is the CAT scan machines they're all just falling apart right now. Mm-hmm. And sometimes even very basic medical stuff just don't exist, like IV or even disinfectants. And so hospitals routinely cancel their scheduled procedures and basic surgeries because of the shortage on these equipment. And then there's a lot of materials that the latest technology or up-to-date materials or medicine is not available. So you have doctors that need to substitute with older medicine or things that maybe are not very safe and have higher risks, but it's better than nothing. So they have to become experimental, and knowing that there are better, safer options out there, but they don't have access to them due to sanctions. And just recently, I was talking to a friend who's an oncologist. She mentioned that she recently lost 3 patients because they didn't have access to the antifungal medicine called amphotericin, which is not something that is super hard to get to, but because of sanctions, it's just completely became non-existent in Iran.
Thank you. Thank you. Sima Jan, I know you also have some experience in the same level of the medications.
Yes. Like pretty much all of you, I also have loved ones in Iran, and I'm constantly worried about them. In particular, I have 2 nieces who are doctors in Iran in 2 different provinces, and I hear, they're working day and night pretty much during the corona crisis. But much like what Salome said, I actually recently did an interview with both of them for MERIP, the Middle East Report and Research Institute. And some of the issues that they're facing precedes corona, of course. This is something that we have been dealing with in Iran, which is lack of access to medicine and equipment, in particular, cancer medication, I lost my sister in 2015 to cancer, actually, my niece's mother, my sister, who basically had to go with her children to buy chemo meds from Nasser Khosrow Street and other parts and carry it in ice boxes to the hospitals for it to be administered. She also, during, when US sent a virus, Stuxnet, and people think this is conspiracy theory, but I actually witnessed this happening. Her radiotherapy was disrupted exactly because of the virus that broke down all the machines that worked with nuclear energy. So she was sent to Imam Khomeini Hospital, which had a radiotherapy machine that was not computerized and did not have basically an accurate gauge. And that basically meant that they burnt her lung in hospital in Iran. And she had to have multiple surgeries to recover from that. So the crisis with medicine precedes coronavirus, but it has been exacerbated exactly because of this. I was talking to my nieces just yesterday, and they were saying that there are 4 medications, even though there is no treatment for corona, but they give antiviral medicine. And there are 4 treatments that they're supposed to give in a cocktail for advanced corona patients. And 2 of those are non-existent in Iran. And out of the 2 that exist in Iran, one of them is extremely hard to find. And one of them is actually an antiviral medication that they give to HIV patients. And because of the corona crisis, that medicine is now extremely hard to find, which puts HIV patients at high risk. And they come to the hospital basically looking for the medicine, and they get exposed to the virus because of the number of patients that are in the hospital. They also talk about ventilators. The ventilator machines that they have are, of course, before the sanctions, and because of the overuse, they're breaking down. And they, besides the ventilators, they need these connectors and tubes that are supposed to be disposable. Before Corona, they were using them. They're supposed to be one-time use. They were using them 3 times and disinfecting them because of the sanctions. And now, obviously, with the Corona pandemic, they can't do that. The quality of the equipment they get are very low because they basically have to circumvent the sanctions, and they come from, basically some cheaply made products that come from China in particular, and medicine too. The side effects of chemomedicine that are available in hospitals are low quality, and the side effects are extremely high, nausea and so on and so forth. And only those who can afford it can really go and buy it in black market, if you can find it in the black market, that is. So we really have a medical catastrophe in Iran, and I'm not going to take too much time of other people, but there are so many stories that I hear from my nieces and nephews. Many of you know that sending basically money is difficult. You need to send it to organizations that have OFAC clearance. And some of those organizations, because of Trump's restrictions, were not able to renew their OFAC license. So I had to basically send money to my niece's hospital to buy PPEs, personal protection equipment, fundraising among people, just ordinary people, to send it to the hospital directly through kind of alternative channels. So there is really the WHO, for example, people assume that because of the World Health Organization shipment, now there is medicine or there are kits. That is not the case. Like I said, neither of my nieces' hospitals have received any of this. And that means that because there are so many people, 83 million people, and so many people are infected, that the shipment from WHO is not going to really make a difference. The answer to it is to lift the sanctions and to remedy all the damage that sanctions over the decades have caused in Iran.
Thank you very much. Before we go to the next person, I just want to mention that the CODEPINK has with the collaboration of Moms Against Poverty, is an organization that with a license that they can conduct and also send some COVID-19 relief material to Iran, and they can do this because of the sanction. It's very difficult to all organization or any organization to do that. So Moms Against Poverty, they are doing that at CODEPINK is in collaboration with them. We will provide you all with further information, but also you can visit our website at codepink.org/Iran. Fatemeh John, Dr. Kershavaz, are you, I'm sure you are in touch with your friends and families in Iran. Do you have any specific stories or in general that you want to share with us?
Yes, absolutely. And before saying that, let me just in support of what Sima was saying, sometimes there is this notion that certain items are exempt from sanction, and that's an absurd notion because the transactions are sanctioned. It doesn't really matter what you want to send or do. People are afraid of dealing with Iran. And to give you an example, and that doesn't have anything to do with COVID-19, but it's very important, a couple of our students whose parents from Iran were paying their tuition fees have been in serious trouble just getting the money to the university because the money has to come from Iran. And banks and all kinds of financial institutions are terrified of dealing with Iran. Many of you might have heard that organizations like Iranian Studies, or you have enough, it's enough to have the word Iran in your name, you basically are going to be treated like someone who's going to cause serious problem. And now going back to the issue of COVID, I actually have an ex-student who was here, did an MA with us back in Iran with her husband. Both are suffering. And fortunately, they both seem to be past the danger, but I was speaking with them, and one of the points they made was exactly what were made by Salome and Sima, that medical equipments break down and that's it. You cannot get them fixed because there isn't the spare parts and so forth. They were also saying something that I had not thought about, which was softwares are sanctioned. So you go into App Store, for example, and this is not just playing around, you're doing your work or you're doing, looking up some important piece of information. You go to App Store and it tells you that, sorry, you are in a country, you cannot use this. So that particular software is sanctioned for you. It's not just the hardware that of the equipment that you need to buy. And so one thing that I want to really get across, particularly to our family and friends among the Americans, is to know how much anger and a sense of humiliation this causes for Iranians, that they basically feel that in this dire situation, they're being punished. And as it was pointed out, when you want to get around the sanctions, you have to have the special means to do that. You have to bribe certain people, you have to see some other people. And so this accentuates class difference in an indescribable way, really, that certain people will become entitled more and more to that very minimal thing that's available, and the others will be deprived of it. So what I want to say is that I do see this year as another bad historical memory that is going to last for a long time. And just as Iranians remember the coup that overthrown Mossadegh, they're going to remember being sanctioned during a pandemic. And this not only causes a lot of problems for the two countries, but it gives an amazing opening to extremists to say, this is what we have been saying all along. You cannot deal with the US, you cannot negotiate with the US. So I think this is a far more critical historical moment. And of course, it has all kinds of health and issues for Iranians, but also very, very historical moment.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Kershavaz. Ms. Sussan Deyhim, it's wonderful to have you in this panel. And I'm sure you definitely are in touch with your family and friends, but also we know that sanctions specifically hit women mostly. Sanctions or war or any problems, and among them, particularly probably artists. If you are in touch with your friends and families who mostly are artists, and how do they suffer and how do they deal with this? If not, so please just share with us in general what you hear from Iran.
Well, artists have been suffering in Iran for 40 years now. I mean, there's absolutely no respect, and especially women. They've been deprived from, existing even, so everybody has been working in underground circumstances. I don't even know how female vocalists have been able to even sing and keep it up with these techniques they have. So that criteria has been sabotaged, identity kind of situation for a long time. And of course, this recent the sanctions obviously cannot help the artists, because so many of these artists, interesting underground artists who found a voice in the last 5 to 10, I would say 7 years, and they were brought out of Iran with people who could afford the responsibility of getting them out, performing all over the US and Europe. And there was such a wonderful movement in terms of, they're bringing their messages, their lament, their talent, and introduce it to the international community. All of that has stopped. Nobody can bring any of these artists to the United States. And Europe has followed Trump administration. And fortunately, it seems like Europe is opening some doors in terms of interaction with Iran. So it's been devastating for the artists. It's been devastating. It's been devastating since day one. And it's been devastating because they found a voice, they came out, and we had all these wonderful artists. And for us, being in exile for 40 years, we were able to hear the work that has been done in Iran, and in visual arts, in cinema, in music. And now all of that has stopped since the sanctions. I think that the sanctions really should equal the violation of human rights in Iran, because the existential reality of people in Iran right now, because of these sanctions, has fallen in the category of violation of human rights. And adding the coronavirus epidemics, that is even like, it makes it like, is this the 10th world instead of the 3rd world or 4th world? I have never heard as much cry for help from friends and family in Iran. And it's not even, some of them are, privileged people. They are like in the country and, living outside of Tehran, Tehran, that when you see some of the, images from Iran, people are driving the car. Sometimes a sister or friend sends me a video of like, here's, Tehran streets. I feel like, are you in Glasgow in February? I mean, the level of pollution for a country that sells billions of dollars of oil prior to the sanctions, to treat their people with that kind of pollution, it's really heartrending. As far as the coronavirus is concerned, all I hear is lack of education, because people don't know what information they can rely on. So for the safety and security of their own, because there's no structure in a medical structure that can help Iran not to have catastrophic consequences from the coronavirus. So we're left with educating people as to how to protect themselves, at least the people who have access to internet and educated enough to follow these things. So a friend of mine, Bahar Azadi, who's a wonderful researcher and she lives in Paris, had forwarded 3 videos from Dr. I have to remember, forgive me, I sent you the links, but my memory
Yazdan Panoh.
Thank you, Dr. Professor Yazdan Panoh. Okay, they're very educational, they're very comprehensible. It's in Farsi, so if any of you can share it with friends, to share with friends, that people can get concrete information about what they can do and tell their friends. And I also know that Iranian people, because there's such a physical culture, we love hugging and kissing and hanging out in these hard moments. People want to get together and share, you know, compassion, and it's the absolute wrong time for all of this. So people should be informed. I know my own family, I have a very angelic sister who is outside of Tehran, and every time I speak to her, she's a very jolly, happy person, but every time I speak to her for the last few months, she's crying, not for herself, but for the community, the people, and they cook for 200, 300 people every week, put it outside, and people, the situation is dire, and the sanctions were meant to weaken this Islamic Republic of Iran, or the structure of political structure they've disastrously built in Iran. But it's not helping that situation, and it's definitely putting the existential reality of Iranian people at a human rights violations state.
Thank you very much. Before I go to Sussan Tahmasebi, I just want to say we probably have responses among ourselves to whatever we've heard from each other. And also there are some questions online that Sussan will later lead this and will ask the questions. Now, Sussan Jun, I want you to tell us what you hear, or what you have heard daily, probably, because I know you are in touch constantly with your family and friends. So what do you hear? My question to you is in two parts. One, so of course, sanction is from the United States, and the rest of the world basically following the US, as people are suffering because of that, but also there are some shortages from the authority and Iranian government. So if you hear anything about them, but mainly I want you to talk with us and let us know what you hear about women, and how do they suffering, and the level of their suffering, and how do they cope with it, if there is any way that they are specifically doing it, please.
Yeah, so just like everywhere else, the rest of the world, this crisis is impacting women a lot more than, you know, or in different ways, and maybe more severely than, at least at a social and economic level, than it's impacting other people, and it's impacting men. First of all, women have to take care of their family members as they become sick. A lot of, you know, the economy has been suffering for so long because of the sanctions, and this has impacted severely the poor, and especially poor women and other marginalized groups. So along with Azadeh Moaveni, we did an article about the impact of coronavirus on an already sanctioned Iran. And we focused a lot on what's happening, you know, both the responses, the creative responses that Iranians are having, you know, how they're banding together, coming together to sort of address this, but also how it's impacting women. And one of the activists that I talked to, one of my former colleagues, said something, you know, she said, it's really, it wasn't strange to me that Iranians were dying at such high rates, because by the time coronavirus hit, Iranians were already depleted in every aspect of life, that they were already weak. It had been months and even years for many who hadn't been eating well. They had nutritional deficiencies, they had health problems, so they were already extremely weak. And we hear often that one of the ways to beat this virus is that you have to have a strong immune system. But if your immune system is already suffering because you're poor, and this is the result of the maximum pressure campaign, then it's really hard to fight this virus. And you know, long before this, actually, people were being laid off because, you know, they had looked forward to improved economic situation, and perhaps for a very short bit after the Iran deal, the economy started to improve, but then the reimposition of the sanctions impacted that economy. Some of the same things that are happening everywhere else really started happening much earlier in Iran. Businesses started closing out. And people I talk to, a lot of this is not, you know, it's hard to document this in terms of, you know, statistics, because the Iranian government doesn't have statistics on this, but a lot of businesses, they started to lay off women. They first laid off women. I have friends who work with businesses on, you know, to sort of educate them on prevention of sexual harassment. All of those programs stopped, or predominantly, you know, not completely stopped, but they really slowed down. And then at some point, you know, when these sanctions, at every sort of iteration of these sanctions as they kicked in, you know, groups of women started getting laid off, other people started getting laid off. So Iranian society is already extremely weak, and so it impacts them a lot worse. And because women suffer discrimination, they're discriminated against the law, socially, they don't have access to the job market, you know, they're already economically, you know, hindered by the reality of life, then this pandemic is going to impact them a lot worse. And, you know, we see that, we've seen that all along, and we see it everywhere else. And yeah, so, I mean, you know, and I also, for this article, I also talked to people who were working with groups of women, predominantly women-headed household in some of the most deprived areas of Tehran. And, you know, this is an area where you have, you know, high rates of drug addiction, and you have, you know, there are people who work there, who live there, or tend to be day laborers. Their work has completely come to a standstill. Even before that, you know, and it happened right at the time of the new year, where they expected that perhaps they would make a little bit of money, and everything shut down, and they're already suffering. I have friends who have businesses who've had to shut down their businesses. So it's really, it impacts everybody a lot, but especially the most marginalized groups: women, children, the elderly, ill, people who are poor, immigrants, sanctions in general, but then this pandemic.
Yeah, it is, and hurting people very badly. Before we enter to the next section, and thank you very much for sharing with us, I just want to mention again, there are some works that the CODEPINK already is doing, and please check our website at www.codepink.org/Iran. You can find lots of material how you can help. And this is, of course, is also open to all of us here to share and see what are other ideas that we know. What can we do? I'm asking the panelists if you have, you know, some ideas that how can we help? How can we do anything that reduce a little bit of the level of suffering that people are going through? Again, if you are ready to donate, please donate to Moms Against Poverty. You can find more information on the website, and the CODEPINK website. Also, I really urge people to go to the website, and you can find some information about the writing a letter to Nancy Pelosi, and encourage her and ask her to join other senators, other Congress people, to actually with more pressure to lift the sanctions against Iran in these very dire conditions. So I guess I leave the open to Sussan June, if you want to please continue.
Yeah,
from
so
here
I have
on.
some, thank you very much, Leila. So I have some questions to ask each of you, you know, very much related to your field or the, you know, the interest that you've shown in the past. So Fatemeh Jan, we talked a lot, I think we touched a little bit about how sanctions have actually impacted Iranians long before this pandemic. But can you talk a little bit about how they've impacted Iranians socially and culturally?
Yes, I think that.
And can you, I mean, if you can comment, I don't know, your voice keeps going in and out. So
okay.
Yeah,
Is
now that
better?
you're close, it's much better. Yes, thank you.
Is it better? Okay.
I want to hear everything.
So, yeah, I mean, I touched on this slightly earlier on to say that it has caused a great deal of a sense of anger, a sense of that, you know, Iran is always isolated, you know, kept outside the world as if there is a world and we just don't belong there. And that causes a lot of, you know, really you talk to people who used to be happy and smiley and, you know, enjoying life, and then you see a sense of disappointment, a sense that they're not able to see the light at the end of the tunnel. And that really is heartrending. And then the other thing is, one thing that I come up against as I talk to people is that, well, there is a lot of talk about corruption in Iran, and there is quite a bit of it happening, but the sanctions are actually, number one, support for corruption, or creating an environment of corruption, because again, it give privilege to certain individuals who can go out and do things and take it away from the rest of the society. So people feel doubly hurt by it. But I want to, in particular, touch on one incident which recently, sure you all know, that Mr. Pompeo apparently brought up the suggestion that Iran is now weak enough that we could take military action. And the fact that, I mean, this to me is a very clear crime against humanity, to say that the pandemic has weakened them enough, let's now go in for the kill. You know, that's basically what it is. But what scares me is that it could be said. It could be said, and that says something about the level of dehumanization that has happened about Iranians. They're kind of spendable. They are, you know, they are people whose death doesn't count as death. I mean, Sima has written on that eloquently, you know, so that level of dehumanization, and it really terrifies me. And I think culturally that's a disaster. And, you know, some of us write poetry, others perform music, others do other ways of reaching out. And I want to encourage all of us here to do whatever we can to bring in something of the life, of the normal life that exists in Iran, despite all of this, and put the people of Iran there to be seen as a normal, vibrant people who, despite all of this, for 40 years, inside and outside issues, that they have achieved so much. So it's culturally, that's one thing that really worries me. And then I think there is a distrust about any financial help getting to the people that we want them to get to. So anybody, I mean, I'm delighted to see that CODEPINK is doing this. Anybody who could have connections in Iran to make sure that these resources are going to get there and be used for the people who need them. And if there is one thing we can do for Iran at this point is just keeping the hope alive, not letting people to slip into a sense of total disappointment and depression, and feeling that the world literally has forgotten about them. Yeah. You know, you all know that when the World Bank wanted to give the loan to Iran, just the loan was prevented by the United States. So that causes a very strong sense of hopelessness in Iran, which you know, really worries me more than anything else. So I hope we can use whatever means we have to keep that hope and vibrancy alive, so that we can go through this dire times and hopefully to better times.
Thank you. Salome, how, you know, we have a couple of questions also, but it lines up with the question that I wanted to ask you as well. The people who support sanctions support it because they think that it impacts negatively the Iranian government. And so now we've seen, as a result of corruption and ineptitude on the part of Iranian government, and also maximum pressure, a society and a structure that's, you know, unraveling. I don't think that the Iranian government is about to fall apart, but I think that there's a lot of the fabric of society is unraveling at the hands of both Iranian government, but also because of the maximum pressure campaign. Who suffers the most as a result of this? Is it the government that's suffering? Is it, the Revolutionary Guards that's suffering, or is it the Iranian people? What's your take? Because this is the argument that supports those who advocate for sanctions, if they want to punish the Iranian government and the Revolutionary Guards.
Yes, definitely. And unfortunately, we see a lot of people within the Iranian American community who also support this position. But ironically, the sanctions has turned the Revolutionary Guard Corps into a financial superpower. Anyone who reads and does some research on the topic will see that now. They have always been, since the revolution, in every sector. They have a big portion of the agriculture, mining, transportation, construction, in any industry. They always had a part. But because there were sanctions placed on Iran after the revolution, so any chance that the private businesses had, get a part of the action, it was kind of killed by the sanctions. But there was a private sector, very weak, which after the Obama administration, the sanctions started to really flourish. There was, after a long time, there was some domestic competition even, and there was a bidding on different projects. Even there was a biggest, I read recently that there was the biggest one was a multi-billion dollar bullet train project that opened up to private companies. So, it was kind of, Iran was playing the role of the world stage, and people, normal, regular people, entrepreneurs or civilians were finally getting into what the fortunes that our country had to offer. But after the Trump administration rolled back the sanctions and also put the toughest sanctions on that has ever been put on Iran, the private sector was just completely got decimated. The guards, the Revolutionary Guards, they're everywhere now. They control borders. They smuggle everything. And they are the only entity that can easily circumvent sanctions. They control a massive black market for everything, even the consumer products that everyday products that people need. And the whole trade sector became so centralized. It wasn't like that. It's crazy how it became recently, which is really ironic. Again, when you think about the American value of free trade, and that the fact that the average man having access to the opportunities that anyone has, but Trump administration robbed this little opening that the average Iranian people had from the Iranian citizens. It could be something that could have been something that really empowered people and could have led to real change in Iran. And that's what I believed when the sanctions were eased. I was getting really hopeful. I want to get a real life example from one of my friends. I went to art school, undergrad, I studied design. So I have a lot of friends who are into, designing clothes and accessories and jewelry. So one of my friends from college, she started designing this. She had this small jewelry business, and after the Obama administration eased sanctions, her business boomed. She started actually doing international, sent her stuff overseas to Europe and even America, because she could actually get paid, and there was a lot of openings. And she actually moved up from her working from inside her living room. She moved into a real workshop and she started hiring people. This is what, and when you think about it, this is what real hope looks like. But what happened after the Trump administration? I mean, you can guess what happened. All of that completely. What happened? First of all, all of the international revenue just disappeared. She couldn't send anything overseas anymore. But not only that, because of the economy collapsed, people obviously are not buying jewelry anymore. I mean, people can't buy food. So her whole business is completely gone now.
A lot of stories like that. Sima, so a lot of people who support sanctions now are arguing. Now, I mean, we've seen the last couple of weeks that a lot of people have spoken up asking the US government to sort of, suspend its sanctions just so that Iran can deal with this pandemic, which is, Iran was an epicenter really in the region. And they cite the impact they can have in the region, especially in the war-torn countries, because if it, they don't have the health structure. And I think Iran is also suffering greatly in terms of health structure. So we've seen these calls from the UN, from world leaders. We've seen numerous op-ed articles in the New York Times, the Washington Post, asking for this. And, there's a lot of collective action happening. But those who support sanctions continue to say that even during this time, that there should be no sanctions relief, that if there is sanctions relief, it's going to benefit the Iranian government. It's going to benefit those, those bad actors, as they call them in the Iranian government. It's going to support them to crack down against its own citizens, the Iranian government to crack down against its own citizens. It's going to support the Iranian government so that it can support its regional allies, in Lebanon and Iraq and Yemen, etc., and the wars that it's involved in. You've written about this. So I mean, basically, what they are criticizing is that the Iranian government's lack of transparency and accountability and lack of democratization. And in your book, you really talk about this paradox of promoting rights and democratization during time of sanctions. So what would you have to say to these people who are advocating the continuation of sanctions despite this pandemic?
Sure. Like you said, Sussan, of course, the sanctions, and everybody else on this panel said, the sanctions have been affecting the most vulnerable among the Iranian population, and also women, and I would add refugees and queer and trans people, and I'll talk about that. Basically, people who are in the margins of the society in a time when there's competition for resources. People have to do more than one job. Of course, those who are laid off are refugees who are discriminated against, are queer and trans folks, refugees, Afghan refugees, women, and so on and so forth. But this question of if we impose sanctions, then the Iranian, there will be a regime change and so on and so forth. My response to that is that we have to look at the past 40-something years of the Iranian history. Fatemeh mentioned this, and you did as well, that there have been many gains in the realm of civil society in Iran, in particular after 1989, after the end of the Iran-Iraq war. So we know that during war, and I consider sanctions to be a form of war, of course, that caused slow death, the discourses of national security heighten. And that is exactly the time that there is no possibility of dissent or protest. We saw how the protests for the hike in the gas price just recently in November, or the water protests, were repressed violently by the state. And that was exactly under the rhetoric of collusion and collaboration with foreign powers, right? So I think it is exactly in the name of national security in times like this that sanctions are not actually helping social movements, but they're helping the state. They give a form of excuse to the Iranian state to quash and repress these protests more violently, because these are seen as times of national security. So we see this with, and you know that more than anybody else, Sussan, with Iranian women's movements, right? Iranian, and Fatemeh also knows about it, everyone pretty much on this panel knows that Iranian women and Iranian women's movement are not really voiceless. They have been fighting. They have been really, really active and very vibrant in a sense. But then it is exactly because of sanctions, it is exactly because of wars that these movements are pushed back decades, right? All the gains of the Iranian women's rights movements, labor movement, students' movements are pushed back exactly because the sanctions create a situation where the priority becomes fighting the enemy, right? So it is under this rhetoric that actually, and I have written this, like you said in my book, that there are many women who are doing this kind of work. Of course, the only voices that are heard are people like Masih Ali-Neshad, right? Yes. Those are the ones who are assumed to be the voice of Iranian women. But Iranian women in Iran have been doing really good work. But then the way that their movements are undermined are exactly through this notion of, well, we need to put sanctions. No, the sanctions are not helping the Iranian people. They're actually making the situation so that rather than working on all the causes that these different social movements have, all the focus is on surviving day to day. Right, we were just talking about lack of access to food, lack of access to medicine, or being laid off from one's job. So these are the moments that the sanctions are actually not being productive. And we saw the example of this in Iraq. 500,000 children alone died as a direct result of sanctions. And that was exactly the time that Saddam Hussein, rather than basically, any kind of social movements, and my colleague Zainab Saleh writes about this, the repression got tenfold. And that is what we are seeing. These are the times that actually any kind of dissent becomes impossible. And like I said, we saw that with the protests around the gas prices. So the legitimate protests of Iranian people become repressed because they're seen as instigations by the foreign governments and so on and so forth. And if I may say something, there are people, for example, in my area of work, people are saying that, well, there are so many queer and trans people who are leaving Iran. And I have written about this in my current project, that as a matter of fact, the UNHCR, the UN High Commission for Refugees, does not admit that people, queer and trans people who are leaving Iran and started leaving Iran in high numbers after 2010, which was actually under Obama's administration, the tightening of sanctions, it was because queer and trans people who left Iran are the working class people. These are actually economic refugees. And they left Iran because they didn't see any future, right? There was no hope. If you ask people, queer and trans folks who are in Turkey, stuck, by the way, because of the Muslim ban, even though they have their basically refugee recognition, but they can't come to the US, or they couldn't go to Canada for a while. They will say that they left Iran because there was no future for them, because there were no jobs for them. So people in the margins of society who are the most affected by this. For example, with the trans folks, before the state would give a subsidy for gender affirming surgeries, and that, because of the sanctions, was reduced significantly, so that people who would be able to have gender affirming surgeries could only have, for example, in the case of trans men, just hysterectomy, but there was no money for the rest of it, right? Or Afghan refugees, basically, where are the ones who left in high numbers after 2010, exactly because of the deterioration of the economic situation in Iran. I'm talking too much, so I'm going to stop here. But I don't know if I answered to your question, Sussan, in terms of this idea of rights. I can talk more about the paradox of rights and how the empty claims of defending human rights when actually people don't have the right to food or medicine.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, yes, you did answer, and I think that when society is under siege in this way, then the government also becomes much more defensive, and the society becomes securitized, and it's really becomes very difficult to advocate for what we call those more progressive rights, because everybody's thinking about eating.
Absolutely, it's a
how to make a living, and it's exactly. And I hear that often from my colleagues inside of the Iran. They say, we used to talk about women's rights, we used to talk about these more progressive, these the right for women to be president. So these very sort of elevated. This is the kinds of rights that we're talking about, and along with other rights. But then now it doesn't make sense. We almost seem irrelevant when we talk about that. Because people are concerned with eating and how do they make a living. And so and so we have a lot of really rich questions coming, and we started late, and we just got the okay to continue on a little bit longer because the conversation is so rich. So that relieves me, and I know it relieves Leila a little bit. So I'm gonna now ask Sussan a question. So I think one of the questions that came through was that did the Iranians blame their government, or do they blame the US, or do they blame both? And maybe you can talk a little bit about that. What do we need to sort of get through this very difficult time? I mean, there's blame on the Iranian government and sort of its mishandling of this current crisis. But what can you say? What should we do in terms of moving forward? I mean, what do you think we need to do?
Well, I
what
think
do we need to deal with this crisis at this point?
before the sanctions, there was such a unity in Iran in terms of this was a good moment. People were finding energy, and there was unity in terms of like, okay, the democracy in Iran needs to start within the society. It can't be imposed. But we have an astounding group of, educated doers and shakers, knowledgeable people inside and outside of Iran. There was a very interesting energy in terms of change and asking for your rights, changing things in Iran. And the debate was always like, how do we get rid of this the regime? And that's where there's a lot of discrepancies between Iranians who surreally, in my opinion, and it's unbelievable that any Iranian would think the war is the answer. That is like just, I cannot imagine why would any Iranian think that war would answer. But it was between people who said, no, we don't need the war. We could make things happen. All the progressive movement in Iran, everything that was built, it was killed by this movement of sanctions, especially because, as you mentioned, many of you mentioned, as soon as there is tension, political tension, social tension, every progressive movement that is really vital to changing things, the movements are the first thing that go away, and the power goes to the regime or to administration, Trump's administration, in terms of killing everything that lives, and so they kill all the movements. And so the society becomes really weak and can't think for itself. And it gives more power to the governments. And if the governments are great governments, then that's not a bad thing, because first of all, this wouldn't exist. And secondly, they would come up with good choices. But unfortunately, we're stuck between a regime in Iran and hardcore Republican administration here, and both of which really, I don't know where their heart is at, because it's not pro-humanity. There's a lot happening here in this country. I live in Los Angeles. I mean, the level of homelessness in this country, in one of the richest and most progressive cities in the country, is surreal. So you can imagine that, what kind of support we could offer to the people of Iran. So I think that the sanctions should be approached as globally as a human rights violation in this very acute moment. I mean, we're talking about hundreds and thousands of people dying in this epidemic situation. And there's no way, sadly, that we're going to come out of this in Iran, because there's no infrastructure. I really don't know what to say in terms of proposing anything. All I can say is that we have to request that that wonderful woman, Nancy Pelosi, really takes this as one of the achievements of her achievements, and really introduce this bill, because the situation in Iran is really, really bad, and people are really suffering. And I know it's many, many places in the world, but these sanctions are really like a violation of certain rights. It's not like it's happening in a society because certain parts of Middle East or Africa are like, just at this point in time, they're poor. This is like creating devastation by will, creating a devastation in the country, in the society, and ravaging the people. It is not something that needs to be done. And now there's this talk about the idea that, yeah, the government of Iran now is really weak. It's a good time to go to war. Really? This article has come out the last 4 days that I have to say, the pompous Pompeo has this plan, and it's absolutely, I mean, how could we not be furious? But what does anger do more? You know, I mean, we really have to come up with peaceful and logical and rational solutions to these things, because finger pointing and making our regimes, our governments, flexing muscles with each other has costed both cultures, Iranians and Americans, a lot of inconveniences. And so we have to find a way to have people step in and think people before governments. And I don't know how this could happen, but you know, I think the idea of asking Nancy Pelosi to really push for that would be a good thing.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Sussan. So I'm going to turn it over to Leila, but I'm going to ask her a question that actually was put forth by somebody watching that I think is an important question, and something that, you know, is being debated, I think, at least in sort of in Iranian circles, but maybe even being put forth by some people, even though this government, this US government, claims that it's not after regime change, it is sort of courting some potential groups that claim, you know, want to be the next rulers of Iran. Mm-hmm. So the question that's come forward is, what would happen if in Iran, if the government fell apart right now? And is there any group ready to take over, or would it be chaos or civil war? What would happen? I mean, I think this is, you know, people don't admit it. Some regime changers who are proponents of sanctions actively want to have regime change, but what will happen? What will happen next? So I think maybe you can answer that, and then, you know, take some of the other questions to panelists, some good questions, so you can facilitate the next section.
Thank you. I guess we can look at Iraq and see what will happen to Iran if the government fall apart. You know, we are not by any means, I guess, we are here, each one of us, of these women who are sitting here, we are not really in love with the Iranian government because, you know, of many things they have done. But again, we should really think about it and see whatever happened to this government, which is a central government, which has been in the power for 40 years and knows what is going on, at least inside the country. So if they fell apart, we will see exactly like what happened to Iraq. So it would be devastation, I believe. So if there are any other, you know, person here, they can add, they want to add to this. This is my idea of that. But before I go to other people, I just want to thank Sussan Deyhim for mentioning the Nancy Pelosi's, and please go to our website and please call Nancy Pelosi or write to her office and ask her to join the senators and Congress people and to lift the sanction and go forward with that. So if there is any other thing that some of the people wanted in the panel, they want to just share as a last word, or what will happen to Iran, or what will happen if the Iranian government fell apart. So please share.
May I, Leila Zand, just say that, first of all, I'm really hoping for a regime change at this end. And please allow me to use the word regime for the United States. Language should not be used exclusively to dehumanize one side. I want to really make us cautious about the kinds of ways in which Iran is made into into people who can be treated in this way, partly through the language used about us. So yes, I think the regime in the United States is very short-sighted. And as you said, Iraq is there, Afghanistan is there, Syria is there. And just the sheer number of external groups that would be imagining that they can recruit inside Iran if the central government falls apart, and how they might take advantage of that. I think that's something that if a politician doesn't see that, and I don't know what to say about it. But I also want to say that I don't think the Iranians, it doesn't have anything to do with how happy they are with the overall condition. And I don't want to apologize every time I'm saying something positive about Iran by saying how bad certain things are. But I think if you talk to Iranians, I don't think that the majority of them, the overwhelming majority of them, want an external force to come in, drop bombs on them, land or even not land, and then have a sense that that's going to lead to vitality and positive change and moving forward. So I think that people of the United States and the regime of the United States should be disabused of this assumption that they will have the hearts and the minds of Iranians any more than they have the hearts and the minds of the Iraqis and the Afghans if they attack. That is really, there's no question about that.
If I may follow on that, I really appreciate what you said, Fatemeh, in terms of thinking also about the US as a regime, but I would also go further to say that this idea of Iran as a regime really erases the nuances within the Iranian state. Some of the contestations to the policies, whether it's the rise in the gas price or social restrictions, come from members of the Congress in Iran. So we can't really just kind of like have this brush of a regime change. There are contestations. Iranian regime has a process. Iranian state has a process, and there are you could make the argument that the US, despite its claims of democracy, is not really democratic. Look at the forms of election that happens here. Look at the way that the US, and I think Sussan Deyhim mentioned this, in terms of houselessness, level of poverty, lack of access to healthcare, affordable healthcare, the way that now the number of deaths in the US have reached, I think today, to 7,000 from coronavirus. So, as they say in Farsi, به خودت بزن به جوالدوز به خود جوالدوز بزن. I don't know how to say it in Farsi. But anyway, this idea that first let's deal with, whether US is a model. US by far is not a model for democracy, and we can't really think about this as US and Iran relations, because US is an empire. It has a history. There are uneven geopolitical relations that we cannot ignore when we think about US intervention in Iran. And as Fatemeh said, we have seen the devastating effects of this in whether it is from Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria in our own region, to Honduras, the immigrant caravan and the crisis that we have at the US border, the camps, the detention camps at the US border, the kind of violence against indigenous peoples in the United States. So we need to also think about those things when we assume that the US is the land of opportunity and land of democracy. So I would say that, many people in Iran are also very, yes, they are critical and angry at the Iranian state as sanction profiteers and all that, but they also don't want any kind of foreign intervention from the US. They don't want the US to come in and basically create chaos the way that it has in Iraq and Afghanistan. If anything, this kind of US threat and intervention makes people not have contestations because of a fear of Iran becoming another Iraq or Afghanistan, because they know that if they basically be on the streets, the US will use its forces to intervene, and then it will basically derail the legitimate movement of Iranian people and be hijacked the way that it was in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I think we need to be really careful in thinking about which voices of these opposition groups are heard and which voices from within Iran are suppressed in mainstream US media.
Exactly. Thank you very much. You said it well, and I cannot agree more with everything, of course, here been said. I just want to mention that we are against sanctions because we believe sanctions are a form of war. Mm-hmm. And as much as war, it destroys the communities, the society, and the families. So we need to do whatever we can to lift the sanctions. Please continue working and let us know if you have new ideas, if you came to new conclusions, how can we expand our work with other colleagues as well. I just want to mention one last thing. Of course, we are here to talk on behalf of Iranians, but also we should remember there is a sanction on Venezuela, sanction mm-hmm. on Cuba, and sanction on Syria. So we need to also, Gaza, exactly, on many of these fronts, and we need to work on their behalf as well. So if, I don't know, Sussan John, if there is any specific question that
Can I add one important thing? Well, please. We also, it's very important to say when we talk about the United States of America, 50 million people here are not for war, for sanctions, this is still a amazing country and culture. Right now, this is a really bad time, but we have to also realize that there needs to be some conversation. By creating more tension between the United States government and Iranian regime, for the moment, it's really a recipe for disaster. There needs to be some communication. People should talk to each other. There needs to be diplomacy. Otherwise, it won't happen. So I want to acknowledge the 50 million Americans and all the progressive people in the world who are completely against this sanctions, war, of all of the countries you mentioned, so that we also energize the people who are in this and don't put them in the same criteria as the right-wing, conspiracy or right-wing ideology.
Exactly. Thank you.
Can I say one more thing that I forgot to say, which is that in terms of ideas that you asked, Leila, I think for those of us who are academics, teaching, you don't have to be an Iranian person to teach about Iran sanctions. So I'm asking my colleagues to please teach about the devastating effects of sanctions. If you teach women gender studies, you can talk about the gender effects of sanctions on Iran. If you teach in anthropology, I'm an anthropologist by training, you can actually read the kind of work. If you're teaching in environmental studies, you can think about the environmental effects of this. The air that Iranians are breathing has 10 to 800 times more toxins, exactly because of the homegrown industries that the Iranian state has developed in response to the sanctions, because they can't send the crude oil outside to be refined anymore. So they have created these homegrown industries that creates 10 to 800 times more toxins. And this is why the rate of cancer is in Iran is high. And as Sussan said, this is a this is a humanitarian crisis. And these sanctions should be seen as a violation of human rights. It should be seen as a form of war on the Iranian people. In terms of what we can do, we can teach about it. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I'm doing is basically producing these wonderful t-shirts that you see, and some other ones that basically say have a no war, no sanctions message. We have a Facebook page, and I'm gonna share that really quickly with you guys, if I may, which basically is say no war on Iran, where you can buy these t-shirts. The money has been going to organizations that help Iranians, and we have a billboard that we are basically trying to produce in different cities. So please support. If you have questions, you can write me an email. This is the billboard that is going to go up in different cities. Madre, which is an organization in New York, has supported has given us some money to have a billboard in New York. So you can support us by having this billboard go up in your own cities. This is the billboard. And also Madra has given $5,000 that hopefully we'll be sending to, when I say we, it's really grassroots, it's me and basically, artist friends who have made these wonderful t-shirts that we are sending to mothers, the coalition that includes Mothers Against Poverty, which is also keep children in school and so on and so forth. Thank you for the opportunity. Sorry, I'm talking too much. I just wanted to do a plug on the grassroots efforts. You don't need to be a part of nonprofit organization. You can just do this form of fundraising, this form of education on your own, because I think it is it is our responsibility as those who live in the US to support the people of Iran through these efforts.
Perfect, beautiful. Thank you very much.
That's
And we will add
fantastic.
this information to the CODEPINK page also for people who want to later.
Please add the educational links to in Farsi, and if you could, all of you, share with your friends.
Yes,
it's quite well
great.
done, and it could be very useful.
Beautiful. Yeah, we will do that, and we will add this information to our Iran page at the CODEPINK.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A pleasure, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Before we close, I just wanted to say one quick thing, and then maybe ask Salome, since she spoke less than everyone else, to sort of, then maybe she can close. But there were a couple of questions that came through on human rights, and again, I think that many people have said this throughout their presentations, is that sanctions and this constant threat of war create a securitized environment in which civil society can't work. I think Iranians continue to advocate for human rights inside the country. Their voices are drowned out by people outside because their space is so limited. But consistently, people inside the country have spoken up, both, condemning repression against all different groups, particularly against civil society. They really ask for the ability to be able to organize. So, and advocate rights, but also condemning this constant threat of war and sanctions. And this goes for, and I think there was one particular question about the Baha'i minorities. I mean, the issue with Baha'i minorities was an issue that was being brought up, by Iranians inside of Iran very proactively. And what's happening to Baha'is, it's awful, it's terrible, but they were talking about this, and they are still talking about this. They are still working this. We don't necessarily hear their voices because they deal with repression from both sides. So thank you for bringing that up. It's really important. And I want to turn over to Salome to see, since she's the youngest member of this group, and she spoke least of all. So maybe she can have the closing remarks.
Yes, thank you. I want to just talk about education just a little bit. I work with kids, so when we talk about we should educate, we usually think of adults, but actually kids are very receptive to understand. And I found it a lot of ways that, because I talked to kids about wars and sanctions, and I saw that in a lot of ways they're more receptive even than adults, because we as adults, a lot of it we have taken for granted the cruelties of this world, but the kids haven't. So when I talk to them about sanctions, in Iran and Venezuela and Syria, they turn to me and say, that's so awful. Like, and you wouldn't hear that from an adult because we just came to. So I also encourage everyone to just talk to your kids, talk to, if you're a classroom teacher, even elementary school kids, they understand. And these are the future generations that will have a say in the foreign policy of this country. So, and that's what we can hope, that eventually that's how we will achieve absolute peace.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to this great group of panelists. And as Leila mentioned several times, other people mentioned, please take a look at the CODEPINK website to get information on fundraising efforts, supporting Moms Against Poverty, that's working, on coronavirus in Iran. It's supporting healthcare workers. And then take a look at the information on, what to read and, how films to see about Iran if you want to become more familiar. And we'll put links to other information for you as well. Thank you for joining us.